June 4, 1942. The bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, 200 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, Pacific Ocean. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was looking at the sky when the first dive bomber appeared. He had been watching the horizon for enemy aircraft for 6 hours. His combat air patrol, the Zero fighters circling above the fleet, had been shooting down American aircraft all morning. Torpedo bombers from Midway, torpedo bombers from American carriers, wave after wave, coming in low over the water, slow, easy targets for the Zeros. His gunners had destroyed them by the dozen. The Pacific around the Kido Butai was scattered with American wreckage. The morning had been exactly what Japanese carrier doctrine assumed it would be. Then someone shouted. The dive bombers were already in their dives when Nagumo saw them, not coming in low like the torpedo planes. Coming from above, from altitude, screaming down at angles that made them almost impossible for anti-aircraft guns to track. The Zeros were down low, chasing the last of the torpedo planes. The sky above the Akagi was empty of defenders. Nagumo had commanded the carrier force that destroyed Pearl Harbor. He had led the Kido Butai across the Indian Ocean and back. He was 55 years old, a vice admiral of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the most powerful naval air force the world had ever assembled. He had never seen dive bombers attack a carrier that was not defended. He was seeing it now. At 10:22 hours, the first bombs hit. Stay with us here on WWII Silent Valor, because what happened in the 6 minutes between 10:20 and 10:26 hours on June 4, 1942, and what Vice Admiral Nagumo, Admiral Yamamoto, and the senior commanders of the Imperial Japanese Navy said in the hours and days that followed, is the story of how the most powerful carrier fleet in the world was destroyed by an enemy they believed they had already broken. This is the story that Admiral Yamamoto's Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, recorded in his diary, with a precision that tells you everything about what those days felt like from inside the Japanese command. And before we go any further, if this is the kind of deep, unfiltered naval history you came here for, hit the like button right now and subscribe to WWII Silent Valor. We dig through the diaries, the official battle reports, and the personal accounts that never make it into the popular versions of this story. You do not want to miss what is coming next. To understand what the Japanese admirals were thinking on the morning of June 4, 1942, you have to understand what they believed they were doing. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was the architect of Japanese naval strategy in the Pacific. He was also, in a specific sense, the most honest man in the Japanese High Command. After Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese government and military were celebrating what they considered the destruction of American naval power in the Pacific, Yamamoto was not celebrating. He had told the government before the war that he could run wild in the Pacific for 6 months, perhaps a year, after which he could promise nothing. He had been right about the first part. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Empire had expanded across an area larger than the continental United States. And Yamamoto understood, with the cold clarity of a man who had spent time in America and who understood American industrial capacity, that the expansion was already the problem. The American carriers had not been at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. They had survived. And as long as they survived, they were a threat that could not be managed by territory or by diplomatic maneuvering. Yamamoto needed to destroy them. Midway was the means. The plan was this. The Japanese would attack and seize Midway Atoll, 1,100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. The Americans could not allow Midway to fall. It was too close to Hawaii, too important as an early warning post. They would have to respond. And when they responded, Yamamoto would be waiting with the most powerful naval force ever assembled. 11 battleships, 8 aircraft carriers, 22 cruisers, 65 destroyers, against an American fleet that his intelligence told him was reduced to perhaps 2 carrier groups and no battleships. The numbers were not close. They were not supposed to be close. Yamamoto did not intend to fight a battle. He intended to execute a destruction. Chester Nimitz, commanding the United States Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor, knew what was coming. Not because his scouts had found the Japanese fleet, not because diplomatic cables had leaked the plan, because his cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese naval code. Commander Joseph Rochefort ran Station Hypo, the code-breaking operation buried in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor. His team had been working on Japanese Navy Code JN-25 for months. By May of 1942, they had broken enough of it to read the outline of what Yamamoto was planning. The target was designated AF in Japanese communications. Rochefort believed AF was Midway. His superiors in Washington believed it was something else. Rochefort arranged for Midway to transmit a plain-language radio message reporting that its water distillation plant had broken down. Within days, Japanese communications reported that AF was short of fresh water. Rochefort had been right. Nimitz called his intelligence officer, Commander Edwin Layton, into his office. He told Layton he needed something specific, not a general estimate of Japanese intentions, a precise calculation. Where would the Japanese carriers be? At what bearing and range from Midway? At what time? On what date? Layton studied everything Rochefort's team had produced. He gave Nimitz an answer. 325 degrees bearing from Midway, 175 nautical miles, at 0600 hours on June 4th. Nimitz later said that Layton's estimate was off by 5 degrees and 5 miles. He positioned his carriers accordingly. June 4th, 1942, 043 hours. The Kido Butai Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway at 0430. 108 aircraft, bombers and fighters, headed southeast toward the atoll. The strike was designed to destroy Midway's air defenses and clear the way for the invasion force that was following several hundred miles behind. What Nagumo did not know was that Midway's radar had been tracking his planes for an hour. American fighters were already airborne. And the 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, were positioned northeast of Midway, exactly where Layton had placed them in his briefing to Nimitz, exactly where Nagumo did not expect them to be. The strike on Midway hit the island hard, but the return message from the strike leader, Lieutenant Tomonaga Joichi, was not what Nagumo needed. Tomonaga radioed that a second strike on Midway was necessary. The island's defenses had not been eliminated. The airfield was still operational. If the invasion force was going to land safely, Midway needed to be hit again. Nagumo had a second strike force on his carrier decks. It was armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, anti-ship weapons, designed for the American carriers that Yamamoto's battle plan assumed would not arrive until Midway had been neutralized. The decision Nagumo now faced was the decision that military historians would debate for the next 80 years. Should he rearm those planes with bombs for a second strike on Midway, or keep them ready for the American carriers? His search planes had found nothing. His intelligence said the Americans could not possibly have carriers this close to Midway without warning. He ordered the rearming. At 0728, while the rearming was underway, a Japanese search plane reported a sighting. 10 ships to the northeast, no carriers mentioned. Nagumo ordered the rearming stopped. He waited for more information. At 0809, the search plane sent a follow-up. One of the ships appeared to be a carrier. Nagumo ordered the rearming to stop. The planes would go back to anti-ship weapons. But the planes were now in various states of half-armed transition. Torpedoes had been removed. Bombs were on the deck. The process of reversing everything and reloading anti-ship ordnance onto planes that were already crowded on the hangar decks, while simultaneously recovering the first Midway strike that was beginning to return, while simultaneously managing the continuous waves of American aircraft attacking the fleet from every direction, was exactly the kind of organized chaos that carrier operations produced even in good conditions. These were not good conditions. At 10:20, Nagumo received a report that more American carrier aircraft were approaching. He gave the order to begin launching his strike as soon as possible. He was 6 minutes too late. At 10:22, dive bombers from the USS Enterprise and the USS Yorktown arrived simultaneously over 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers. The Zeros were down low. The carriers were surrounded by their own exhaust from the refueling and rearming operations. The flight decks were crowded with aircraft, with ordnance that had been loaded and unloaded and reloaded, with fuel hoses still connected to planes. The dive bombers found conditions that naval aviation doctrine had never encountered and never expected. 4 of the most powerful carriers in the world, essentially defenseless, at the exact moment they were most vulnerable. The first bomb hit Akagi at 10:22. The first bomb hit Kaga 30 seconds later. Soryu was hit at 1:25. 3 carriers, burning, in less than 6 minutes. The accounts of what happened on Akagi's bridge, in the minutes after the bombs hit, were written by the officers who were present, and those accounts share a quality of restrained precision that makes them more affecting than any dramatic reconstruction could be. Captain Taijiro Aoki, commanding Akagi, tried to keep the ship fighting. The fires were spreading. The ordnance stored on the hangar deck, the bombs and torpedoes that had been loaded and unloaded through the indecision of the morning, began cooking off in the heat. Secondary explosions tore through compartments that the bomb damage alone would not have destroyed. The Akagi, which had launched the aircraft that attacked Pearl Harbor, which was the flagship of the force that had made Japan briefly the dominant naval power in the Pacific, was dying from the inside out. Nagumo refused to leave. Captain Aoki came to him. The bridge was filling with smoke. The passages below were burning. There was no way down except by rope from the forward bridge window. Aoki stood in front of his admiral with tears in his eyes and told Nagumo that he would take care of the ship. He told Nagumo that everyone, the staff, the crew, implored him to shift his flag to the destroyer Nagara and resume command of the fleet. The fleet still needed a commander. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, was still operational and already launching counterstrikes. Nagumo transferred his flag. He crossed to Nagara on a line, hand over hand, and looked back at Akagi burning. An officer standing beside him later recorded that the admiral said nothing. He looked at his flagship, at the smoke and the flames visible through the hangar openings, and his face showed nothing. Not grief, not anger, not shock. A terrible blank emptiness, the officer wrote, that was worse than any of those things. 300 miles to the west, aboard the super battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the first reports at 1100 hours. The message from the Kido Butai arrived in fragments, the way terrible news always arrives, incomplete, contradictory, requiring the reader to assemble the picture from pieces that did not fit together cleanly. Yamamoto's staff had been following the battle from the main body, far enough behind the carriers to be out of the fight, close enough to receive radio traffic. Yamamoto's chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, was standing beside the admiral when the reports came in. Ugaki maintained a detailed diary throughout the war, one of the most important Japanese documents of the Pacific conflict. Eventually published decades after the war and used by historians to reconstruct the inner experience of the Japanese Naval Command at its most critical moments. Ugaki wrote about the moment the reports from Midway reached Yamamoto. He wrote that Yamamoto removed his glasses. He set them on the table carefully, with the deliberate care of a man performing a simple action, because simple actions are the only actions available when the larger situation has moved entirely beyond control. He asked quietly, "All carriers?" His staff confirmed. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, heavily damaged and burning. Hiryu undamaged and launching counterstrikes. Yamamoto stood motionless. Ugaki wrote that in that moment, watching the admiral's face, he seemed to have aged 10 years in 10 seconds. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor. The man who had warned the Japanese government that they were starting a war they could not win. The man who had designed Operation MI to destroy the American carriers before American industry made the Pacific War unwinnable. He had gambled everything on this battle. In 6 minutes, the gamble had failed. Rear Admiral Taimon Yamaguchi commanded the carrier Hiryu, the one Japanese carrier that had not been hit in the initial American dive bomber attack. Yamaguchi was 50 years old. He had studied at Princeton. He spoke English. He understood America in the specific way that Japanese officers who had spent time in the United States understood it, not as an abstract enemy, but as a country whose industrial capacity he had seen with his own eyes, whose people he had spoken with, whose scale he could calculate in ways that made the mathematics of the Pacific War uncomfortably clear. He launched his counterstrikes immediately. The first wave found the Yorktown and hit her hard enough that the American carrier had to be abandoned. Yamamoto, receiving the reports aboard Yamato, briefly believed that the battle might still be salvageable. 2 American carriers lost. 2 Japanese carriers lost. Hiryu still operational. The battle was not over. At 1700, American dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu. 4 bombs hit within seconds. The same pattern that had destroyed Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu repeated itself on Hiryu's flight deck. The explosions, the fires reaching the ordnance and the fuel, the secondary detonations that turned a damaged carrier into an uncontrollable inferno. Yamaguchi refused to leave his ship. His crew pleaded with him. His chief of staff argued with him. Yamaguchi heard them out. He transferred his surviving aircraft crews and his wounded to destroyers. Then he told his captain, Tomio Kaku, that they would go down together. He sent a final message to the fleet. He expressed his profound regret for the outcome of the battle. He tied his cap to the ship's mast so it would go down with Hiryu. He sat down on the bridge in the darkness and waited. He was one of the few Japanese admirals to die in combat during the entire Pacific War. At 02:55 in the morning of June 5th, Admiral Yamamoto gave the order that the Japanese High Command would spend the next 3 years refusing to fully acknowledge. Occupation of Midway is cancelled. All forces will withdraw. Ugaki was beside him when the order was transmitted. He wrote in his diary that Yamamoto looked, as he gave the order, like a man who had just signed his own death warrant. The architect of the plan that had started the war was now transmitting the order that marked the moment when the war became unwinnable. Not officially, not in the cables to Tokyo, which were carefully constructed to minimize the scale of the disaster. Not in the public announcements, which would say nothing about Midway for months, but in the operational reality that Yamamoto understood completely. 4 carriers lost, 348 aircraft destroyed, 2,500 experienced Japanese naval aviators and aircrew dead, against 1 American carrier sunk and 1 damaged. The Kido Butai, the mobile strike force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, that had ranged across the Indian Ocean, that had been the instrument of Japanese strategic ambition in the Pacific, had ceased to exist as a fighting force in the course of a single day. The officers of the Hiryu, rescued from the ocean in the days after the battle, were not taken to naval hospitals in Japan. They were taken to a naval base at Kure and held in isolation. The Japanese government had decided, at the highest level, that the Japanese public would not be told what had happened at Midway. The survivors were forbidden to communicate with their families. Their letters were censored. Officers who had participated in the battle were transferred to units deploying overseas, where their first-hand knowledge of what had happened would not contaminate the official narrative that was already being constructed for home consumption. The official announcements were carefully worded. Japan had inflicted serious losses on the American fleet in a battle near Midway Atoll. 1 carrier had been lost. The exact figures: 4 carriers, 348 aircraft, the irreplaceable experienced aircrew who could not be replaced in the time frame that the war required, were classified at the highest level and shared only with the officers who needed them for operational planning. Yamamoto was not replaced. Nagumo was not court-martialed. No admiral lost his command as a direct consequence of Midway. The Naval History magazine article that American naval historians would publish decades later noted this with the specific puzzlement of analysts trying to understand an institutional response to catastrophe that chose to absorb the lesson rather than act on it. The same love of dispersal, the same complex battle plans, the same assumptions about American willingness to fight. These things did not change after Midway in the ways that the scale of the disaster should have demanded they change, because to change them would have required the Japanese Naval Command to acknowledge, officially and institutionally, what had actually happened on June 4, 1942. What Midway meant strategically was not immediately apparent to either side in the days that followed. The Americans understood that they had won something significant. They did not yet understand how significant. 4 Japanese carriers destroyed, 348 aircraft lost, 2,500 experienced aircrew, the pilots and navigators and bombardiers who had trained for years, who had flown at Pearl Harbor and in the Indian Ocean, and over Darwin and Singapore, who were the product of a training pipeline that Japan did not have the industrial capacity to replace at the rate the war now required, gone in a single day. The American carriers were intact. The American training pipeline was producing new pilots at a rate that Japanese planners found difficult to process. The exchange rate at Midway, in terms of what each side lost relative to what each side could replace, was not a ratio that Japan could sustain across a long war. Yamamoto had understood this before the battle. He understood it with greater clarity afterward. He continued to command the combined fleet. He continued to plan operations. He continued to execute the strategic calculations of a fleet commander who understood that the war he was fighting had become, after June 4, 1942, a war of attrition rather than a war of decisive engagement. And a war of attrition against American industry was a war that Japan had already lost. The fates of the men who commanded at Midway were documented by the same war that had defined them. Nagumo was given shore commands after Midway. He was not formally punished. The institutional culture that had refused to acknowledge the defeat at Midway also refused to formally assign blame for it. He was simply moved away from carrier command, given positions that kept him occupied, but away from the operations that his failure at Midway had made him unsuitable to command. He ended up on Saipan, commanding the island's defense as American forces closed in during the summer of 1944. On July 6, 1944, as American Marines overran his final positions, Nagumo committed suicide. He was 63 years old. He had commanded the force that attacked Pearl Harbor. He had been on the bridge of Akagi when the dive bombers came in. He had transferred his flag and watched his flagship burn, and said nothing. Yamamoto died 9 months after Midway, in April 1943, when American P-38 fighters intercepted his aircraft over Bougainville Island. The Americans had decoded the message announcing his inspection tour, the same way they had decoded the messages that told them Midway was coming. He was killed before he could reach his destination. He was 59 years old. He had built the Kido Butai. He had planned Pearl Harbor. He had warned Japan not to fight America. He had been right about everything, except the outcome of the battle he designed to prevent the war from becoming what it became. The Japanese sailors who survived Midway came home to silence. The wounded were hospitalized in isolation. The unwounded were transferred before they could speak about what they had seen. The official history that Japan was constructing, the history of a nation that had fought brilliantly and was winning, had no room for 4 carriers burning in the Pacific. The survivors lived with that silence for years. Some of them wrote about it after the war. The diaries and the memoirs and the testimonies that eventually emerged from the officers and men who had been at Midway, who had watched Akagi burn, who had stood beside Yamamoto when the reports came in, who had transferred Nagumo from his flagship on a rope while the ship died beneath him, contain a quality of suppressed experience that is different from the accounts that came out of the European War. Those accounts were written in the post-war period, with the relative freedom of defeated nations working with historians who wanted them to speak. The Japanese accounts were written in a culture that had a different relationship to defeat, to public acknowledgement, to the gap between what had happened and what could be said. What the Japanese admirals said when they realized Nimitz had destroyed their carrier fleet is preserved in the documents they left behind, in Ugaki's diary, in Nagumo's official battle report, in the post-war accounts of the officers who survived to write them. They said it in formal operational language. They said it in the careful understatement of professional officers describing events whose full significance they could not yet process. And in some cases, like Yamaguchi on the bridge of Hiryu waiting for the end, they said it in silence that meant more than language could. If this story hit you the way it hits us every time we go back into these accounts here on WWII Silent Valor, drop a comment below. Tell us, do you think Nagumo made the right call when he ordered the rearming that morning? Was there a decision point where Midway could have gone differently? Or was the battle effectively decided before the first plane launched, the moment Nimitz positioned his carriers where the Japanese did not expect them? We read every comment, and the conversations you start in that section are some of the most serious military history discussions happening anywhere online. Share this video with someone who understands that the Pacific War was decided not in the battles that were won, but in the 6 minutes that changed everything. We will see you in the next one.